right. Well, all right, now that we're started, just want to say good morning to everybody, to our panelists, and then also those who are joining in. I'm Alexander Harlan. I'm a research associate with the Orion Policy Institute, and thank you for joining this webinar. Before we get into it, I just want to give our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves, give a little bit of their background. So we'll start with General Teichert, then Dr. Packer, then Dr. Gastold.
Wonderful. Alexander, thanks for having me, and I'm honored to be part of this esteemed panel. My name is Brigadier General Retired John Teichert. I'm a retired Air Force fighter pilot and test pilot. I ended my career focusing on whole of government national security strategy and policy. I was the nation's senior defense official to Iraq, deployed for 14 months. And then I ran international affairs for the Air Force and the Space Force. I retired about a year and a half ago. Now I do keynote speaking, a variety of consulting, and I wrote a leadership book, Boom, Breaking Barriers, Challenging Convention, and Igniting Innovation Through Leadership. Check it out on Amazon if you're stuck in a bureaucratic quagmire and want to turn it into an innovation juggernaut.
It is on my list, so thank you for mentioning that. Dr. Packer?
My name is Robert Packer. I'm a professor at Penn State University. I concentrate on study of war, political economy, and also American foreign policy. And over the past couple of years, I've been running a number of seminars called the Penn State Correlates of War, where we talk about issues of national security policy. Obviously, we've been focusing on the situation in Ukraine, also to a certain extent, the situation in the Middle East as well. So that's what I've been doing.
Excellent, excellent. Dr. Gastold?
Yes, thank you for having me here. My name is Przemysław Gastold, and I'm assistant professor at War Studies University in Warsaw, Department of Security Threats. I also work at the Historical Research Office of the Institute of National Remembrance in Warsaw. So the institute which is responsible for handling and storing the intelligence files from the Cold War period. I received my PhD from Warsaw University, Faculty of Journalism and Political Science. I work on intelligence studies, communist movements, and international terrorism. I also work as a managing editor for the Security and Defense Quarterly in Poland. And in this field of intelligence, I cooperate with our friends from Denmark and from Estonia and from Great Britain. And we've got this annual conference, Need to Know, which will be held this year in Warsaw in October, where we'll be discussing the Russian-Soviet factor in Europe, specializing in intelligence activities. Thank you.
Oh, wow, that sounds really cool. I might want to jump in on that. All right, so I guess just to initiate and for our viewers, obviously February 2022 rolls around and Russian forces invade eastern Ukraine. In response to that, historically neutral Finland and Sweden submitted applications of membership to join NATO. And now 2 years into the war, it's time to take stock. NATO has expanded, NATO ally members have raised their defense spending, and Russian credibility has degraded. Russia has subsequently enhanced cyber operations and disinformation operations in the near abroad. And essentially, I mean, we're at a point now where we need to look and see, is this the jumpstart that NATO needed to reinvigorate itself by adding Finland and Sweden? And what does this mean for the future of European security and geopolitics in general? So I wanted to start with a question, open discussion for our panelists. What's going to be the most significant contributions that Finland and Sweden bring to the alliance?
Alexander, let me jump in a little bit. And this comes from a senior defense official that I had an opportunity to engage with before I retired from Norway. And he was talking about Norway's reorientation as a result of Sweden and Finland joining NATO, because naturally and geographically, Norway would love to be focused on north and to the west of their country. But before the addition of Finland and Sweden, they had to cover down significantly into the Baltic Sea. And his takeaway for the biggest reason why NATO would benefit from the addition of Finland and Sweden was that Norway could reorient to where they're naturally inclined to focus, which is to the north and to the west. and would allow Sweden and Finland now to cover down to the south and to the east throughout the Baltic Sea in a way that really played to their strengths and allowed Norway to play into their strengths.
Excellent, excellent. Dr. Packer?
Well, the greatest significance is that it changes the equation in the Baltic. As you may know, Alex, I've been very concerned about the situation in the Baltic Sea, given that the Russians have that exclave in Kaliningrad. So the addition of Sweden and Finland has, I wouldn't say it has neutralized Kaliningrad, but it has reduced the effectiveness that the Russians can exploit Kaliningrad. Whereas before, the Russians could use it to cut off the Baltic states from the rest of NATO. Now, with Sweden and Finland, the Baltic has become, in many ways, a NATO lake, which now exposes the Russians inside that area.
Dr. Gastel?
Yes, Sweden and Finland's accession to NATO fosters a more stable and secure Europe. Both countries possess a deep expertise in confronting Russian tactics, unlike some southern and western NATO members, and their contributions can be examined on several levels, like, for example, the military enhancement. Both will enhance military capabilities, bringing strategic assets, experience, and also understanding of how to counter Russian expansionism. For example, they also seriously approach the alliance financial requirements. For example, while NATO struggles to meet its 2% of GDP defense spending target among all members, Finland will exceed it this year at 2.3%, and Sweden will reach the 2% goal, which shows that actually they are seriously treating the financial obligations. When it comes to military enhancement, despite their neutrality, Sweden maintained a capable military with cutting-edge technology and also a robust military industrial sector. And we've got plenty of examples, like the fourth-generation Gripen fighter jets, which makes also Swedish Air Force the largest in the Nordic region. They've got Leopard 2 main battle tanks and also Gotland-class attack submarines, which are ideal for the shallow waters of the Baltic Sea, and also they will be very important in anti-submarine warfare. We've got Sweden unique amphibious troops, fast combat boats, which also will enhance NATO's flexibility and defensive options in coastal warfare. So we've got plenty of dimensions. For example, the political dimension. Both countries have significantly contributed to the Ukrainian war effort. Finland has provided over 2.5 billion euro in support through 22 or 23 aid packages. And recently, like a couple of days ago, Sweden established a special 6.5 billion euro budget for military aid to Ukraine for years 2024 and 2026. So both nations are taking the initiative to support Ukraine with military hardware, recognizing the stakes of Russian victory. So we've got also other dimension and other factors which should be analyzed, but I will leave it here.
I'm actually glad that you brought up, I guess, enhancements in, I guess, like the military technology, because one of the follow-up questions I actually had for General Teicher was just his thoughts on the Gripen E.
No, so I think that the combination of industrial, economic, and military factors that the two panelists just pointed out really punctuate the importance of adding those two countries into NATO. And as someone that has operated both with Swedish-made equipment and with those two militaries in Sweden and Finland that are already extremely capable and pretty well integrated into NATO tactics, now having them as a part of the alliance allows us from the very ground up to create tactics and operations with capabilities in the economic, industrial, and military realms that are already superb. And I just look forward to seeing how NATO thrives as a result of now real, true, trusted integration with those two powerhouses in the north of NATO.
Oh, for sure, for sure. And Also, this is just, I guess, kind of a more military technology nerd out thing on my end, but have you guys seen, I guess, going back to the more amphibious assaults and things like that, their CB-90 fast assault craft that can go over like the rocks and things like that. I think it can go like 50 miles an hour or something ridiculous. And I don't know, I just thought that was really cool. But actually, so this actually, I guess, what is it, segues perfectly into my next question, which is, how does further development of this NATO lake impact both European and Russian strategic posture going forward? Dr. Packer?
Well, first, as I said, it to a certain extent reduces the importance of Kaliningrad, which means that the Russians may do one of two things. One is perhaps reduce the importance of Kaliningrad in terms of their overall strategic posture, given that they are exposed. But also on the other end, it could mean that the Russians may wish to use Kaliningrad every so often to remind NATO not to do certain things that the Russians do not want. I see all of this as part of the fighting inside Ukraine. Ukraine has fundamentally changed the relationship between NATO and Russia. And just to give a little background here, my view is that Ukraine is an existential issue for the Russians. The Russians are willing to fight in order to keep Ukraine out of NATO. Ukraine is more of an extra issue, if you will, for NATO, meaning that if they can get Ukraine into NATO, that would be a way to further box in the Russians, but it's not something that is existential. And this explains to a certain extent how NATO has approached Ukraine over the past 2 years, where it has been hesitant to give Ukraine certain weapon systems, and then slowly over time they give in and then adjust based upon what the Russian reaction is. So I believe that it is still open question as to how exactly the Russians are going to respond to this. I believe we have to wait until after the Ukraine war is over, and then we'll have a better idea of what the Russian actions will be.
Dr. Gassel or General Tykert, do you think this impacts or changes, I guess, Russia's calculus moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, speaking about the NATO like the NATO's expansion definitely enhances its capability to safeguard security in the Baltic Sea region and defend also the Arctic. Moreover, it offers geostrategic access for defending the Baltic Sea, bringing Allied troops closer to Russian strongholds of St. Petersburg and the Kola Peninsula. And this northern flank can become the linchpin of Allied defense and deterrence against Russian hostile activities. We can also mention Sweden's geographical position, which makes it an essential part of any NATO defense plan, a fact recognized even by Warsaw Pact forces. And my project on Polish military intelligence operations in Cold War Sweden, based on recently declassified files from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, reveals that the Soviet command emphasized Sweden's strategic location, assuming that Sweden would closely cooperate with NATO in case of the Third World War. And the Warsaw Pact assessment, which, I mean, could be now the Russian assessment, saw Sweden's Baltic Sea position as a potential launch pad for air attacks against the Soviet Union. Additionally, Polish communist generals predicted Swedish territory could provide basis for deploying Western troops during a military conflict. And special attention was given to the strategic significance of air bases potentially enabling NATO to launch attacks on Warsaw Pact countries. And indeed, Sweden plays a vital role in various strategic and logistical scenarios. For example, it can serve a land transit route to reinforce both Norway and Finland. And with Sweden and Finland joining NATO, the alliance gains control of the Baltic Sea. This enables them to supply troops and military hardware by sea to the Baltic states or Poland. A NATO lake could restrict and potentially block the Russian Navy in Kaliningrad, as was mentioned. And while simultaneously allowing allied forces to enhance their SIGINT capabilities. And I think that we have also to mention the strategic significance of the Swedish island of Gotland, which also deserves attention because its central location in the Baltic Sea offers a key vantage point for overseeing and potentially influencing maritime activities. And controlling Gotland grants the ability to disrupt trade routes and military movements between NATO nations and Baltic states. And Gotland's capacity to accommodate air bases and military installations allows NATO to project air power and strengthen its regional defense capabilities, also deterring or responding to potential Russian aggression. And by maintaining this control of Gotland, NATO prevents Russia from establishing a foothold in the Baltic Sea. And this Gotland could be identified as so-called unsinkable aircraft carrier. So its significance is very important while considering NATO's air and naval operations.
Alexander, one of the things we talk about a lot in the military is having to honor the threat. And as Russia is looking at now a doubled land border of NATO alongside of Russia, and now something that is clearly a dominated maritime area, a NATO lake, if you will, in the Baltic Sea, means that they've got to factor in defense against maritime and land assets along those lines of effort from NATO. And that means, one, it complicates their operational posture, but two, it enhances deterrence because it just makes it all the more difficult for Russia to conceive that they could succeed in any of the axes along NATO or towards Europe because of dominance by NATO, both in the maritime and the land regimes, because of the additions of Finland and Sweden.
I absolutely agree. And so I guess, would it be safe to say the consensus of the panel is, I guess, the ascension of Finland and Sweden has been more of a deterrent as opposed to provocative for Russia?
I think it's tough to decide what Putin thinks about because deterrence is all
fair.
about perception.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do believe that he likely understood that his moves in Ukraine could tilt some balances of power and maybe nudge Finland and Sweden towards NATO. I don't think he would have imagined it would have happened as quickly as it did. But certainly his trade-off now is hopes for a Russian-controlled Ukraine while losing the entirety of his northern flank. That's not a very good strategic trade-off, especially because he's not winning in Ukraine. I could see in Putin's mind all of this being provocative, but ultimately the deterrent benefit of having Sweden and Finland, and not just their capability, but their will to stand up against Russian aggression, is a huge advantage for NATO to prevent the next war.
Oh, for sure. And then I guess kind of diving more deeply into this question, I know that the island of Gotland was mentioned and its impact on maritime activity in the Baltic Sea. I guess for anyone, how does this, do you think, impact things like Nord Stream? Dr. Packer?
Well, one, I have to agree strongly with all the statements made on Gotland. Indeed, I've always used Gotland as being the principal counter to what the Russians were doing in Kaliningrad. So having Gotland in NATO is something that's very significant. Now, I would say that in terms of connecting this with the war in Ukraine, in my view, it would have been preferable to have some type of agreement in Ukraine and then use the threat of Swedish and Finnish accession into NATO as a means to guarantee any agreement that you had in Ukraine. So what happened was, as the general mentioned, Finland and Sweden moved quickly into NATO. So I believe that if there is any slight negative here, it is the loss of that particular leverage. But again, this is a plus for NATO in having Gotland and Sweden and Finland in general in the alliance. As for Nord Stream, perhaps Nord Stream is a bit of the past in that the West European countries are trying to reduce their exposure to Russian oil and gas, and the Russians are trying to reduce their exposure to Western Europe. So there's a certain amount of economic decoupling going on here. And the fact that Putin has named an economist as his new defense minister speaks to a Russia that is a bit more decoupled from the West and trying to have a more, if you will, Eurasianist type of national security policy. That's something we can speak more about as the discussion goes on.
Absolutely. And then I guess another thing that I want to get into with, I guess, more so the NATO lake, does this shift, I suppose, like the center of gravity in NATO to a more Baltic centric or still like Central Western European?
I think Russia's, Alexander, I think Russia's got to honor the threat. So while we may internally debate about where the center of gravity is, that all of these elements of NATO are something that Russia has to consider in any potential operations in the future. And that makes their job significantly more difficult with a substantial presence of NATO in the Baltic region or in the north. And I think that certainly in Putin's mind, factoring in any move against NATO with such a large land and maritime presence to the north in Russia is something that would be extremely difficult to overcome, even for an optimistic Putin.
That's fair. And so I guess I know that Dr. Packer and I had mentioned this before when discussing Russia. I suppose now with the ascension of Finland and Sweden, I guess one could make the argument that it would be much more difficult for the Russians to, if they decided to, commence some type of operation punching through the Suwalki Gap. I was wondering if you could have any more or expand on that a bit.
I just would like to briefly come back to Nord Stream because it's important to also frame this discussion about the Western cooperation with Russia. And looking back to 2014, it's worth examining how a large part of Western European countries reacted to Russia's annexation of Crimea and the occupation of Eastern Ukrainian territories at the time. And most of these countries, including NATO members such as Germany and France, expressed verbal outrage and opposition, but did nothing concrete or serious to impose effective sanctions on Russia for its illegal annexation and the start of hostilities. And moreover, most of them continued active economic cooperation, which can be, exemplified by the Nord Stream. And they also became dependent on energy resources like gas and oil. And in this context, warnings from Central and Eastern European countries were largely ignored. And the doubts from the Baltic states and Poland, for example, about growing Russian imperialism were treated with leniency. But however, this situation changed to some extent in 2022 with Germany's revision of its Russia's policy, known as the Zeitenwende, the turning point in German foreign and military policy. However, this change is happening very slowly, and the authorities in Berlin, despite significant financial and military support for Kyiv, continue to pursue, I would say, a cautious and limited policy in this area, as evidenced by the refusal to transfer Taurus missiles to the Ukraine army, which was, by the way, vastly covered by the Russian media. Nevertheless, we can observe a significant change among many Western countries that for a long time downplayed Russia's aggressive policy, but now recognize the great threat that Putin poses to European security. And Finland and Swedish accession to NATO indeed put the central point, the central interest of the alliance towards Eastern Europe.
Absolutely. But I mean, excuse me, but I guess also, I mean, I agree with all those points. I guess going back though, Dr. Packer, and I mean, obviously for anyone who wants to join in, with the ascension of Finland and Sweden, the Suwalki Gap, I'm sure it's now a much different calculus for Russia if they decided to commence an operation through that gap and try to cut off the Baltics. Well, the Baltic Tigers, excuse me.
Well, it is far more difficult for the Russians to do that now, given the new NATO members. And also one thing I want to pick up on that the professor mentioned. And Alex, you know, I've talked about there have been this divide in NATO between what I like to call the legacy NATO members and the Eastern flank. And yes, the Eastern flank have always argued that Russian revanchism was a real thing. And the legacy NATO members say, oh, no, we can integrate Russia into the Western system. And that's the reason why this new decoupling, to the extent that it has happened, is so significant. Also, from the standpoint of a shift in the focus of NATO, yes, Poland and Eastern flank countries are taking, I would not necessarily say the lead, but they are in a more vocal position within the alliance, and their worries are now being taken more seriously across the alliance. Now, whether this will last long term, depending upon what happens in the Ukraine war, remains to be seen. But clearly, this is something that has revitalized NATO in the short to intermediate term, no doubt about it.
Absolutely. And I guess going more to decoupling and things like that actually is a good segue into another question that we have, which is, how much breathing room does Moscow get with almost this political and economic buffer of NATO members that have pro-Russian leadership? I'm thinking of like Hungary with Orban. I mean, I know that right now Fico is fighting for his life after an assassination attempt, so we probably need to wait for the dust to settle on that. But either way, I mean, that still presents a challenge of this alliance, which, some could argue has a primary goal of containing Russia, has, I guess you could call them political moles within it. So I was just going to ask, like, what challenges do you guys see with these pro-Russian leaders in NATO member countries?
Alexander, it certainly makes it more difficult to get to the consensus amongst NATO members to move forward. But my NATO friends, those that work in NATO extensively, talk about how if you want to do something quick, you do it alone. If you want to do something that lasts, you do it together. And so while it makes it more difficult to move forward via consensus in NATO, when they do, or when we do, it makes it all the more powerful when you have the diverse views of a Turkey to the south, or some of these more pro-Russian members of NATO, because it gives this level of unity of effort in spite of the diversity that is a huge signal, not just to Russia, but to anyone else in the world that would tangle or consider tangling with NATO and the NATO strength in unity of effort.
Honestly, that's a very fair point. I actually haven't thought about, I guess, like what you were mentioning, like the diversity of thought of how that actually strengthens it. That's actually, that's a very interesting and good point. I like that. Thank you. Dr. Gastold?
Yeah, we've got different dimensions of these pro-Russian forces in European Union, pro-Russian parties. For example, we've got Hungary, which policy differs from the other NATO members. And just a few days ago, Hungary was visited by Chinese President Xi Jinping. So in this case, we have not only close relations with Moscow, but also with Beijing. And this Hungary's ambivalent stance results from different influences and its complex relationship with Russia, Ukraine, and West. Because when we look at the Hungarian population, we'll see that actually they are not so very pro-Russian. However, they support the non-interventionist policy conducted by Orban, whose idea is to create a Hungary as a country which would benefit from trade with both, as a bridge between the East and the West. So Orban also aligns with Russia traditional values, contrasting them with what he sees as negative Western progressivism. And this cultural alignment fuels Hungarian sympathy for Russian position. And we've got also the decline of democracy and this ongoing quarrels, tension between the EU institutions and Hungary, which also steered the Hungary towards a Russian position. But we've got also different parties, like in Germany, Alternative for Deutschland, which is openly and traditionally pro-Russian. And we've got also many cases where these Russian intelligence forces are trying to infiltrate those parties in order, to shape the agenda. So what we can expect is that the Russians will try to clandestinely support those parties, expecting them to shape the country's internal policies, but also having impact on the international arena. Like, for example, there are some ongoing discussions about when we should lift the sanctions. What kind of equipment should be sent to Ukraine, and how long those countries, I mean Western countries, will continue to support Ukraine, what the taxpayers will say, and so on and so on. So that's a real threat. If the war will continue longer, we can expect the Russians will put a lot of effort in order to exploit those mostly populist movements and parties.
I mean, I guess expanding on that, so do you think that in the future, Russia is going to have more of an emphasis to clandestine operations, intelligence, disinformation, as opposed to overt military action?
I guess my response would be without doubt, without doubt. Just looking at the previous week and the visit of Xi Jinping, it was very strategic what he did there. First, going to France because Macron made some statements about if there is a fight over Taiwan, Europe should not be involved. So Xi Jinping said, well, maybe we could work with that. And then to cap it off, the visits to Hungary and Serbia. A little bit of background here. Back in 1999, I stirred up a bit of controversy when I said the war in Kosovo could have the consequence of causing a weakening of relations between the West and Russia. There is a close historical relationship between the Serbs and the Russians. The Russians were opposed to the NATO operation in bombing Serbia back in 1999. NATO went ahead. It embarrassed the Russians. I would say no accident that within a few months, Yeltsin out, Putin in. And we've seen this very anti-NATO position coming from Putin almost from the beginning. So I see the Russians and the Chinese, for that matter, exploiting divisions inside Europe. Again, not so much will be there in France, but definitely Serbia, which is outside of NATO and probably will not join anytime soon. In terms of Hungary, what the Hungarians are doing, and it's partially domestic politics. Orbán views Hungary as being somewhat separate from the West. And this is part of this great division between what is West versus what is Eurasianist. We see this in Hungary. We see this in Turkey. We have Orbán and Erdogan basically saying we're trying to straddle the line here. We're not necessarily buying into the entire Western position. So we want to have good relations with the East. We want to, if you will, use those relations with the East in order to pry away more concessions from the West. So I will see more. I believe we will see more of that coming from Hungary, coming from Turkey, within NATO. And then the Russians probably trying to exploit the situation inside the Balkans. So it would not surprise me if we see additional turmoil or political machinations in the Balkans. Keep an eye on Bosnia, for instance.
Oh boy. Dr. Gostel, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I fully agree with Professor Parker. I mean, we do organize every year the Zagreb Security Forum, which also discusses the panelists, the members, and the guests. They discuss security threats, and also they discuss what kind of Russian interference and intelligence operations are now being conducted in the Balkans. So Croatia is a country which belongs to NATO. However, Serbia is really infiltrated and might be exploited more profoundly in the future by Russia. Moreover, we've got Montenegro, where the Russian intelligence is very active, and there is still ongoing struggle over the dominance and over the social support for certain ideas, where Russian embassy is very active. And actually, it will pose a real threat in case, for example, when the war in Ukraine will be prolonged, will be protracted. So Russia will try to find some different areas, geographical locations, where they can sow some discontent and maybe rise some tensions. And in the long run, that would be a real problem for NATO countries to tackle those threats simultaneously.
Alexander, one additional thought that I think parlays perfectly into that last one is that it's far more difficult for us in NATO to deter Putin in the cyber world and in the info ops world, because it's not as obvious when Putin in Russia does something in those domains, either to attribute it to them and to convince the public that whatever they did in the cyber info realm is something that could possibly trip an Article 5 action by NATO. And because it's more difficult for us to attribute or us to make that argument in those realms versus the physical realms, then it means that Russia is far less deterred, and we can expect more and more of those activities going forward because Putin believes he can get away with it without a strong response from NATO.
I mean, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, I like to, I guess, make the parable of how Russia has been, commencing operations just below, the threshold of like a military response. And it's almost kind of like the geopolitical equivalent of the little brother pointing their finger at your face and going, "I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you."
I mean, I'm a parent, Alexander, and Russia or malign actors use those same things that our kids do. They push it as far as they can. They judge a response, and if the response isn't harsh, then I'll push further and further and further. And Putin very much calibrates his activities in order to be just below the threshold. And then when he gets away with it, he can dial it up more and more.
Absolutely. And then I guess circling a bit back to Xi Jinping's visit to France, that actually, I guess, segues also into the next question I have, which is, how does the expansion of NATO and then also continued Western support for Ukraine, do you think that that has an impact on China's calculus towards Taiwan? Because I guess the way that I see it, if I were a Chinese military strategist, I could see this from two different perspectives. The first being our geopolitical rivals are spending all this money. They're eventually going to become insolvent, weakening their position, and that gives us a better opportunity. The other side of that coin, however, is I'm seeing firsthand, they're willing to fight.
That is a very interesting question, and one that I spent quite a bit in my national security class addressing. I guess I see it this way. There is limited bandwidth that the United States happen to have. That is, until the United States dramatically increase its total production of ammunition, there's going to be a bit of a trade-off between what happens in Europe and what happens in the Indo-Pacific. Which leads to the debate that exists in national security realms between those who say we should counter this joint Russo-Chinese threat, the Eurasian threat, versus those who say, well, yes, but we need to prioritize what's happening in the Indo-Pacific because it is potentially even more important, and perhaps the Europeans can take more of the lead in terms of Ukraine. I guess I am slightly more in the position of the latter camp, given the situation inside the Indo-Pacific. If you take a look at Taiwan, and yes, the United States have the 3 communiques with China, which says there is but one China, Taiwan is a part of China, and the United States looks for the peaceful emphasis there of reunification. However, we know Taiwan is important in terms of the first island chain for the United States. 2, Taiwan is the producer of very high-end semiconductors. So this is a place that the United States would not want China to gain control over. So that puts a bit of a contradiction in terms of American policy there. One. Second issue is what's happening in China itself. And there has been a debate over, what is it called? The so-called Davidson window, named after Admiral Davidson, who was head of the Indo-Pacific Command, who argued that China may be in the throes of window logic being that the Chinese view that they have a window of opportunity to grab Taiwan within the next few years, after which that American rebuilding of its industrial base will be in full flight. The Americans would then build up its naval forces in the Pacific. So perhaps it's sooner rather than later in terms of Taiwan. And perhaps what we are seeing is part of an overall strategy of the Americans distracted in Europe. Thus, now would be the time for Taiwan. I haven't taken a definitive position on that one per se, but yes, there is a debate over what is happening there and what U.S. policy should be in terms of Taiwan.
Indeed. General?
I would love to take Dr. Packer's class. I should spend some time up at Penn State. I think I would be greatly informed and educated by listening to him. But going back to this idea of deterrence, deterrence is a combination of capability and will in the mind of an adversary. We've got the capability for sure, the United States and NATO, but what we are trying to calibrate in the minds of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party is whether we have the will to come to the aid of Taiwan if China makes the decision to attack, or maybe more broadly, do we have the will to stick with a partner or an ally for the long term in the midst of the face of aggression by Russia in the case of Eastern Europe or China in the case of Taiwan? And it is very important in my mind, in my perspective, that we demonstrate a consistency in our will to defend the free, open, prosperous, and secure world order that we created alongside of our allies and partners and have maintained since the end of World War II. And the moment that China believes that we don't have the will either to intervene if they attack Taiwan or to stay the course if they decide to do so, is the moment that that perception of costs, benefits, and risks in the mind of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party could tip towards making the move and making the move sooner rather than later. Going back to the beginning of the Biden administration, firmly believe that our feckless withdrawal from Afghanistan was one of the prompting elements in the mind of Putin that he could make a move elsewhere and not be countered by a United States because we cut and run on our allies and partners. And I believe China is judging us in the same way based on how we continue to respond in support to Ukraine against Russia.
Dr. Gaston?
Yes, Russia's ability to achieve even a partial victory in Ukraine would still have far-reaching consequences for NATO, the European Union, and the US position globally. And this could embolden ambitions harbored by many global South leaders to shape a multipolar world with a leading role for China and Russia. And to understand China's interest in the war, we must consider how they are analyzing the conflict. And Chinese staff officers, intelligence analysts, and the politicians are closely monitoring events in Ukraine, particularly the course of military operations. They are analyzing the conduct of war, the tactics of offensive and defensive operations, the use of modern technologies such as drones and artificial intelligence, and the effectiveness of Western, mainly American weapons that Ukraine has received as part of multiple aid packages. And it cannot be ruled out that some of the captured American equipment is being made available by the Russians to the Chinese military for research, development, and testing under secret agreements. Similarly, how it was during the Cold War, and Poland might be this example, because in the late 60s, Polish military specialists received parts of American aircraft from North Vietnam for their own research. So the authorities in Beijing are certainly placing a strong emphasis on technical intelligence, acquiring modern American weapons that are also used by Taiwan. However, they also monitor, for example, the role of Russian aircrafts. Most of the security experts, they did not anticipate before the war that Russia would not gain air superiority. So that's also one of the factors. Moreover, the conscript system in Ukraine demonstrates also that manpower still remains essential in modern warfare. So a decisive Russian victory marked by significant territorial gains in Ukraine would be interpreted by Beijing as a signal of Western, particularly American, vulnerability. And this could embolden China to pursue more assertive actions against Taiwan. And the potential for war weariness in the West, coupled with the ongoing economic strain, raises concerns about the long-term sustainability of support for Ukraine. And additionally, a shift in US leadership could also introduce uncertainty regarding future aid commitments. We can ask question, will the US will be willing to provide robust military support to Taiwan after a protracted war of attrition in Ukraine? What if American taxpayers grow weary and tired of the war? And we know that the US passed recently supplemental aid package for Ukraine, but this may be not enough to prevent defeat. Moreover, the US withdrawal from supporting Ukraine would be undoubtedly exploited by China. Therefore, every possible measure must be taken to prevent Russia from winning the war. And in addition to continued military aid, restrictions on how Ukraine can use Western weapons should be lifted, as these limitations are hindering their ability to fight back. And there seems to be a contradiction in our approach to supporting Ukraine, because we are providing weapons, but restrict their use on Russian territory. And this raises a question of logic, especially considering the ongoing Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilian population. And this has to change, and we have to allow Kiev to use the full potential of modern weaponry. And also, the US and NATO allies should consider providing deeper levels of military support to Ukraine, even if it means depleting their own weapons stockpiles. So the worst case scenario, thankfully averted, would have involved a coordinated, simultaneous offensive by Russia against Ukraine and China against Taiwan. And that would be a real problem, because that would have forced the US to make difficult choices regarding its priorities and diversify its arms shipments. And fortunately, NATO intelligence possesses the necessary tools to detect strategic indicators and warnings like troop mobilization, movement, and logistical buildups. It was used effectively in the case of Russian attack on Ukraine. However, the possibility of Moscow and Beijing closely aligning their policies toward Ukraine and Taiwan in the near future cannot be entirely dismissed, particularly given the protracted nature of the Ukrainian conflict. The scenario could involve coordinated military actions in both regions with varying potential outcomes. For example, China might initiate a limited military operation against Taiwan. While this remains a hypothetical situation, recent events like the Hamas attack on Israel serve a jarring reminder that even seemingly improbable scenarios can unfold with devastating consequences. So to conclude, for as long as Ukraine effectively repels Russian attacks, China will closely observe this conflict and contemplate various scenarios regarding Taiwan. Therefore, it is in our security interest to continue to aid Ukraine, as its survival will have a significant impact on Beijing's policy toward Taiwan.
Well, first off, I'm glad that the scenario that you were mentioning, where it was a combined and coordinated offensive, thank goodness that didn't happen. And also, I can't help but chuckle about supplying weapons to Ukraine, but then having limitations on how they can use them. I just can't help but think, oh, government bureaucracy, not using logic, that's a novel concept. No, but and also, I guess, circling back a bit more, actually, I think you were kind of mentioning it, and one of the questions that I have is that, some fear a nightmare scenario where the United States just completely disengages from the alliance and forces Europe to fend for itself. So I guess the question, leaning more towards Dr. Gastel, but please, for anyone in the panel, is an EU defense force possible? What would it look like? And then also, what is the likelihood of American disengagement? Dr. Gastel?
Yeah, the withdrawal of the United States from Europe would be a catastrophic scenario that could signify the collapse and end of NATO as we know it today. The absence of American guarantees of military assistance would have a very negative impact on the state of security in Europe, especially in its central and eastern parts. And one must ask how individual NATO countries would interpret Article 5. For example, if, Russia attacked Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania, and without US involvement, would these countries be ready to send their soldiers in the name of a collective response, or would they, for example, limit themselves to declaring war and setting up a field hospital? And what about the use of nuclear weapons? And if a scenario where the US left NATO were to occur, the European Union would indeed become the natural platform for military cooperation, although any alternatives, such as the development of autonomous European structures and capabilities outside NATO, would be far weaker than what the alliance offers today, and would require many years to achieve some operational level of interoperability. Additionally, it would be necessary to develop appropriate procedures, share the responsibility for costs, build specialized infrastructure, and most importantly, ensure that the participating countries have guarantees of collective defense. However, I believe that the joint EU military force is unlikely to be established in the near future due to too many differences and divergent interests and also priorities among the individual countries. Moreover, many years ago, there was a discussion about creating a common European intelligence agency, but it failed precisely because of these reasons: differences in the interests of individual countries and debates who should control such institution. And in this context, it seems to me that the creation of a unified European army has no real chance of being realized in the near future. What would happen instead? If this scenario raised in your question was to materialize, some countries would have to significantly strengthen their military capabilities, leading to a new arms race on a much larger scale than we see today. Moreover, some countries with nuclear power plants would seriously consider developing their own nuclear bomb or seek a protective umbrella from France or United Kingdom, which would be, however, difficult to achieve. And currently, there is a debate in Germany about acquiring nuclear weapons, as Germans see this type of weapon less negatively than in the past. So the US disengagement from the alliance would undoubtedly lead to increased tensions in Europe and encourage bolder actions by Russia and China.
Absolutely. General Teichert, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, just a foot stomp, and I know we'll all agree on this, that we are very pleased to celebrate the 75th anniversary of NATO this year.
Absolutely.
It has been a massively effective stabilizing force in the world for the last 75 years. And if you look at our national defense strategy, 145 times it mentions the phrase allies and partners as a unique American advantage. And if we, the United States, start to back away from our commitment to this 75-year-old alliance, then it puts all of our relationships at risk and very quickly unravels this unique American advantage that has maintained a free, open, prosperous, and secure world order since the end of World War II.
I couldn't agree more. Dr. Packer?
Yes, I also voice my strong support for the NATO alliance. However, there is one thing where I disagree a bit, and that is in the furtherance of NATO expansion. I supported the expansion in the 1990s to bring in the Eastern flank countries, particularly Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary at that time. And although I had some trepidations, I supported bringing in the Baltic states. However, beginning in 2008, I did not support bringing in Ukraine for the reason that Ukraine is an existential issue for the Russians, and the Russians will fight over it. As I often mention in my classes, and the general reiterated, deterrence is about capabilities and will. But what underlines will is also interest. The interest that you have, interest in maintaining the liberal international economic order, interest in terms of trade, interest in terms of maintaining certain geopolitically important areas. And the issue is that Ukraine is far more important for the Russians than it is for the Americans. And that explains what you view, Alex, as the paradox of the United States giving weapons to Ukraine, but not giving them everything and limiting how they use those weapons. And partially because the United States is not willing to entertain going into a war with Russia over Ukraine. That's simply the way it is. Now, having said that, this is the reason why I supported a situation where, no, Ukraine will not join NATO. Ukraine's position should be similar to that of, ironically, Finland during the Cold War period, where they're able to maintain their internal democratic system. But there will be some limits in terms of its foreign policy. Again, not joining NATO. I believe that would have been far preferable, and that would allow for NATO to use its capital in buttressing the defense of its current members. One thing I do fear is that when you have a number of countries, including those on the eastern flank, sending so many of their weapons, including their air defense systems, to Ukraine, what happens if Ukraine lose? Then all of a sudden you have greater vulnerability in NATO. So I am not one in favor of drawing down the weapon systems and the defense capability of NATO for the service of the Ukraine war. That's something, that's a line I'm not willing to cross. So yes, I am strongly in favor of NATO. However, I'm not in favor of expanding NATO into a country that we know the Russians will fight over. And that explains the contradictions in Western policy. The West is not willing to fight over NATO. And as a result, there is an issue in terms of Western credibility when it comes to supporting Ukraine. My argument has always been, do not get involved in a country that you are not willing to actually fight over when your adversary is willing to fight over it. You get into a credibility problem, and once you get into a credibility problem, then all of a sudden, it becomes one of, we have to do this, because if we don't do this, then that will send a message emboldening adversaries and disheartening allies. So we have to do something here in order to avoid a possibility there. And that's a dangerous situation.
That last remark has some echoes of containment policy. All right, so I actually have, I guess, just one last question. Honestly, more so, I guess, geared to General Teichert, but obviously, panelists, please feel free, and then we'll get into some viewer questions and wrap this up. So I guess the last question I have is, with Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, I guess in like the broader scope of like political debate, people see Finland and Sweden as like these paragons of highly developed countries with robust political rights and civil liberties. I know that there's like that saying or that statistic how Finland is the happiest country in the world. Yet these two countries have their own systems of conscription. And I know one of the prevailing headlines that we've been seeing, at least in American news, is how recruitment numbers are down just across the board. So do you think that these versions of conscription that these developed and robust countries have potentially offers a blueprint to make either the draft or conscript not a dirty word to get those recruitment numbers up? And like, will it change the culture potentially?
I think it's worth considering, and we've been talking in the United States about mandatory public service for a while now. It's interesting when you look at the numbers in the military that less than 1% of our society serves in the military. Less than 5% of our overall society are veterans, and that number is shrinking quickly. So I think it is worth considering. I don't think the numbers are such that we need to consider it just to stay afloat with respect to the numbers in our military. But I do think it probably goes back to something more broad, which is our commitment to citizenship and community within our country. And what can we do to make sure that people feel not just that they have rights, but obligations as a part of our society? And maybe a part of that is eventually a step towards mandatory public service of some sort.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Dr. Packer, Dr. Gastel, do you have any remarks on that?
Oh, I would say the principal difference is liberal democracy versus social democracy. It would be very difficult to move in that direction in the United States because it's so entrenched. Liberal democracy and libertarianism, restrictions on freedom. And as the general mentioned, yes, we do have a society that emphasizes rights far more than obligations. And it would be difficult to put the genie back in the bottle.
Very fair point. Dr. Gasper?
Yeah, I just can add that Sweden and Finland are both the mature democracies with very strong democratic institutions, and that will contribute definitely to NATO's internal political stability. And also most of the population there supports NATO. It's like 89% in Finland and more than 60% in Sweden. And for comparison, Poland boasts a very high trust level towards NATO, which accounts for 94% of society, which supports the being in NATO. And yes, this conscription, and thanks to conscription, a large portion of the Finnish population, it's about 80%, received basic military training and could be mobilized in case of an attack. And alongside Norway and Estonia, Finland was the only country in free Europe that maintained compulsory military service after the Cold War. And yes, because of this neutrality and also because of being close to Russia. And this approach of conscription, maybe obligatory or partially conscription, is gaining renewed interest and debates. In Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark, all recently expanding or reintroducing this mandatory service. And similar challenges are faced, for example, by France, which abolished conscription in 1997, and Germany, where volunteer recruitment struggles to exist. So, interestingly, 65% of French citizens now support mandatory service reinstatement. When it comes to Poland, compulsory basic military service was suspended in 2010, though it was not abolished. And the aim was at the time to accelerate the professionalization of the army, primarily due to different types of threats and participation in military missions, such as in Afghanistan and Iraq. But Poland cannot complain about the number of volunteers. Interest in military service is enormous, and at the moment, almost 200,000 soldiers serve in the army, including over 140,000 professionals, and currently more than 20,000 voluntary basic military service members are training in military facilities. So I think that Finland's example is valuable for Poland, and if necessary, compulsory military service might be reintroduced.
Excellent. All right, so if you just give me a minute, we have a couple questions here. Let me just peruse through them. All right, here's a good one. What role can or should NATO play in addressing Chinese military expansionism, particularly in Africa?
Yeah, let me jump on that one, Alex. I think it's important as we look at the global set of responsibilities and challenges for the free, open, prosperous, and secure world order that we have enjoyed, and certainly Europe has enjoyed, that there are threats stemming from aggressors around the world. And the more likely it is in the mind of an adversary that an organization like NATO would involve themselves in a conflict away from the immediate geography of Europe, the more potent deterrence is. And I have been heartened just in some of the engagements I've been a part of before I retired to see Indo-Pacific allies joining NATO conferences and meetings, and similarly, NATO allies joining meetings in the Western Pacific or about the Western Pacific. And I think that just the thought of engagement from any of those set of alliances or allies that could be applied in other theaters makes our deterrent posture more potent and thus more effective.
Absolutely.
And was the question about Africa, Alex?
Yeah, it just what role can or should NATO play in addressing Chinese military expansionism, i.e. in Africa?
Yeah, I have to say I am somewhat concerned about what's been happening in the Sahel over the past few years. The Sahel region was one that was a French sphere of influence, and France sort of supported various leaders in the area. Many of those leaders had dubious democratic credentials, let's put it that way. And what we have seen is a series of coups and revolts inside the area. Many of the pro-French governments have been overthrown. And we have seen the phenomena of many of these new governments turning to the Russians or the Wagner Group or some combination of the two. That is something that is concerning. It is concerning when the United States may be forced to withdraw its forces from that region, which is a region where you have weak states and it's literally an open door for groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates. So something needs to be done there. If France has lost its credibility inside that area because of anti-French feelings, anti-imperialism, what have you, there will be a need for, be it NATO or the United States, to step in to make sure that this area where you have a number of weak states do not turn into a swamp that transnational terror networks can fill in, or for that matter, the Russians or the Chinese can use to try to create their own sphere of influence in that area.
Dr. Gastel?
Yes, I agree fully with all those statements. And while discussing the nature challenges and threats, we tend sometimes to omit the global south. And Africa is a great example where those covered struggle for influence and for the support is being conducted nowadays by Russia, by Chinese, and by other malign actors. So we have to think about some strategy. However, we also have to understand why and define the causes, the roots, while those countries, for example, in the Sahel, are turning against European countries like France, like America. So we have to define the roots of their position, because not always can boil down to Russian interference. There are some, I would say, strategic failures when, for example, we discuss the global war on terrorism and how the United States devise and design its policy to tackle the terrorist threat in the Sahel. I mean, I know that's the part of other discussion. However, there are some factors which can blame on the Western Hemisphere, which lead to this losing the influence, the blueprint in those regions.
And so, all right, we have about 5 minutes before our time is up, so we'll go through one more question, and then we'll do a quick sign off. All right. How has the war in Ukraine affected Russia's InfoWar/cyber warfare capabilities in respect to NATO? Have they been constrained? Is there a trade-off or fall-off in effectiveness of their work on European and Western politics? A bit of a mouthful, so if you need me to repeat it, please let me know.
Alex, I'm just going to jump in and say that to some extent, Ukraine has been a testing ground for both sides of the conflict in some of these more modern or novel forms of warfare. So to some extent, Russia has benefited and the West have benefited from some of the trials in real world scenarios for a variety of elements of warfare that include cyber and information warfare. And for Russia, it makes it all the more important that they're able to do something to undermine Western support of Ukraine. And the most attractive form of that are those things that are below the threshold of conflict that come in the form of cyber or information operations. So I think both sides have benefited from the petri dish that is Ukraine, but Russia certainly sees the benefit of deterring or undermining the West from these avenues of warfare that are below a threshold for response.
Excellent, excellent. Dr. Packer?
I would say overall, at least in the first year and a half, it blunted a number of the Russian efforts because there was a very strong pro-Ukraine response throughout the West. So Russian efforts, at least in terms of Western Europe and the United States, were blunted. However, as the war continues on and we start to see war fatigue, we'll see how that works. But I would say it would be more of the Russians exploiting genuine war fatigue as opposed to the Russians actually stirring things up on that part.
Fair enough. Dr. Gaspel?
Yeah, I will link this question with Sweden, because Sweden can provide a blueprint for dealing with disinformation and deception. And I'm thinking about the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency, which was established in January 2022, just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this institution aims to enhance the societal resilience and also to counter foreign influence. But Sweden, of course, has a lot of experience in psychological defense, which extends back to the Cold War period. And why I'm mentioning this institution? Because this agency primarily deals with foreign malign information campaigns, usually nowadays conducted online, that use fake news to exert pressure on society, for instance, by undermining trust in government and legal institutions. And this agency monitors rumors that could generate fear and potential conflicts, such as those related to rising energy prices in winter, which could be blamed on the government and spark social tensions and uncertainty. All those factors benefit Kremlin. So when it comes to the contribution of new members of NATO, I think this whole new institution, which is responsible for the psychological defense, but also done in the cyber realm, this might be a real factor and experience and the lesson the old members of NATO can learn.
Excellent. Well, so we've got about a minute. So first off, I want to thank our panelists for the incredible conversation. I want to thank everybody who has tuned in to watch this. Hope that we've expanded your horizons and you've learned something. And I guess it's like the sign off, Dr. Robert Packer from Penn State University, Brigadier General John Tykert from Capitol Leadership, and Dr. Gastol from War Studies University. Thank you guys so much. And before we sign off, do you guys have any publications that our viewers should check out?
Alex, I mentioned mine, Boom, Leadership That Breaks Barriers, Challenges Convention, and Ignites Innovation. Go to johntykert.com if there's anything that I can do for you.
Excellent. Dr. Gastol?
Yes, recently I co-edited 2 volumes on the relationship between state and terrorism, how the Western and Eastern countries during the Cold War used to deal with terrorist organizations. And that's a new contribution, providing new factors of how this state terrorist organization relationship was shaped. So it was published a couple of years ago by Bloomsbury Publishing.
Definitely need to check that out. Dr. Packer?
Well, I am working on looking at American grant strategy and how that influence U.S. foreign policy in general. And the debates that have been going on has really animated how the U.S. has looked at the world.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you everyone for joining. And with that, we'll sign off. Have a good one, guys. Thank you again so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.